I'm here to talk about two articles that were published in the January 10th issue of JAMA. One of them came from our group, one of them from another group at Harvard on regulatory science and devices. Now, that may seem like an esoteric topic and one that may not interest you immediately if you're a clinician and taking care of patients. But we need to know that medical devices have really revolutionized the way in which the medical practice has occurred over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Almost every single procedure that's being done now is using a medical device. Sensors are using medical devices. Actually, the FDA even considers tongue depressors as a medical device. But here the focus is on medical devices that are very important and can be life-saving. Now, most medical devices are authorized under FDA's 510(k) pathway. This requires manufacturers to demonstrate that the new device that they want to sell is substantially equivalent to a previously authorized device. That is something else that was on the market. And the idea here is that if manufacturers make incremental changes in a device, they shouldn't have to start over. There are lots of tweaks that may occur in the course of developing devices, and those tweaks, instead of having them start over and do a whole bunch of clinical studies, if it's substantially equivalent and it's being used for the same purpose, then FDA can authorize it, allow it to be sold. And so many devices go through this pathway. These two studies take a look at particularly the issues regarding recalls and recalled devices. Now, recall has various classes, and class 1 is the most severe of the recall levels. And that's for withdrawing a device that could be life-threatening or cause really substantial harm. And in the study that we conducted, we did a cross-sectional study of all the 510(k) devices that have been subject to this most serious of recalls, this class 1 recalls from January 2017 through December 2021. And what we discovered was that many of these devices that were subject to a class 1 recall had been authorized based on their substantial equivalence to a prior device that was also subject to a class 1 recall. And in addition, we found that these devices that were subject to a class 1 recall were sometimes used by subsequent devices as the basis for their authorization. So it's sort of a flaw or a problem that was seen in the device to which it's said to be substantially equivalent was propagated down the line through generations. And if a certain device is authorized based on a device that had or a class 1 recall, its risk of having a class 1 recall was much higher, 6 times as high than average. Now, this isn't an FDA issue. This is in fact in the law. The law says that if the FDA withdraws a device because of a class 1 recall, it cannot use that device as a predicate for a subsequent device. But if it's voluntarily withdrawn by the manufacturer, it can be. It can be. So this represents a loophole in the law. And the other study similarly began to look at cross-sectionally at devices that were approved by the Food and Drug Administration and identified that of all the ones that were approved, a substantial proportion, in fact, again, in the grand scheme of things, most devices don't have class 1 recalls. What they went and they looked back and they said, what predicted the class 1 recall? They found that, in fact, having a prior device upon which you were based for the authorization to be sold, if that had a class 1 recall, your risk of having class 1 recall also was a predictor, was much higher. Now, you may say, like, well, what kind of devices are we talking about? Well, for example, CareFusion's Alaris infusion pump. This device was used to control the delivery of IV fluids and medications for patients in the hospital. This device is subject to multiple class 1 recalls with hundreds of thousands of units affected. The device cites 3 predicates, 3 devices upon which it said it was substantially equivalent, and then therefore didn't need to do studies in patients because it was already similar to other devices. And in fact, 2 devices also had been subject to recall. So the FDA was put in a position where it sort of was needed to use those as the predicate because it was being sold, couldn't preclude it. It's a loophole in the law that needs to be addressed. So one of the things that we're recommending as a result of our study, and now even reinforced by the other study, is that Congress needs to provide the FDA with the ability to reject devices subject to class 1 recalls from being used as the basis to authorize future devices. That is, if you've had a class 1 recall, then you shouldn't be used as a predicate, as a basis for future devices to be used. We're also adding that we would think that there ought to be greater transparency about the lineage of these devices. Look, as clinicians, we're often using devices, and one of the things we're advocating for is we need, as clinicians, to have a more knowledge, deeper knowledge about these devices and the evidence that upon which they're based. Look, we're used to that with drugs. We in fact, we all demand to know exactly what is this drug based on? Why is it beneficial? What were the quality of the studies? For devices, it can often be hard to figure out, especially if they're through this 510 pathway, exactly what was the basis, because they're being said to be authorized based on similar to another device. And then you got to go all the way back to figure out, well, where was the evidence that supported the safety and effectiveness of that original device, if it even existed? And so I think that as devices even become more consequential in the future, as data science makes them more complicated, and in addition to their consequence, we're going to be in a position where it's going to be more and more important for us to understand the evidence that stands behind each of these devices.